So we're going to talk about Thomas Hardy. Hardy was born in 1840 in the English village of Higher Buckhampton, in the county of Dorset, and died in 1928 at Maxgate, which is a house he built for himself and his first wife, Emma Gifford, in Dorchester, a few miles from his birthplace. Hardy's youth was influenced by the musicality of his father, who was a stonemason and fiddler, and his mom, Jemima Hand Hardy, was often described as the real guiding star of Hardy's early life. She learned Hardy how to read and write before the age of 4. The county of Dorset, where Hardy came from, provided him with material for his fiction and poetry, and he saw himself as a successor to the Dorset dialect poet William Barnes, who had been a friend and a mentor. Other features of southern England also influenced Hardy as a poet, such as the Stonehenge, which inspired the poem The Shadow of the Stone. In 1856 he was apprenticed to John Hicks, who was a local architect, and shortly before his 22nd birthday in 1862 he moved to London and became a draftsman in the busy office of Arthur Blomfield, a leading architect. Driven back to Dorset by ill health in 1867, Hardy worked for Hicks again, and then for the Weymouth architect G.R. Craigmay. Though architecture brought Hardy both social and economic advancement, it was only in the 1860s that lack of funds and declining religious faith forced him to abandon his early ambitions of university education. Hardy's habits of private study were then redirected towards the reading of poetry and developing of his own poetic skills.
From 1898 until his death in 1928, Hardy published 8 volumes of poetry. About 1,000 poems were published in his lifetime. Between 1903 and 1908, Hardy published The Dynast, which was a huge poetic drama in 3 parts, 19 acts, and 130 scenes. The Dynast presents Hardy's idea of evolutionary meliorism, the hope that human action could make life better. The length and scope of the Dynast, which was published in 3 parts over 5 years, resolved in varied and sometimes bewildered and confusing responses. But by 1908, with the publication of the 3rd part, most reviewers were enthusiastic. However, Hardy's lyric poetry is by far his best known and most widely read. Incredibly influential for poets such as Robert Frost, V.H. Auden, Philip Larkin, and Donald Hall. Hardy forged a modern style that nonetheless hewed closely to poetic convention and tradition. Innovative in his use of stanza and voice, Hardy's poetry, like his fiction, is characterized by a pervasive fatalism. Also, Hardy's lyrics are intimately and directly connected to his life. The great poems of 1912 to 1913 were written after the death of Emma on November 27, 1912. Some of these works are dated as early as December 1912, a month after her death, and others were composed in March of the following year, after Hardy had visited St. Juliot, Cornwall, where he first met Emma. Tomlin described Emma's death as the moment when Thomas Hardy became a great poet, a view shared by other recent critics. Hardy's Emma poems, Tomlin goes on to point out, are some of the finest and strangest celebrations of the death in English poetry. Hardy's Emma poems, then, according to Thomas Mallon in the New York Times, are racked with guilt and wonder. They are poems in which he attempts to come to terms with the loss of both his wife and his love for her many years earlier.
Though frequently described as gloomy and bitter, Hardy's poems pay attention to the transcendent possibility of sound, line, and breath, the musical aspects of language. As Irving Hope noticed in Thomas Hardy, any critic can and often does see all that is wrong with Hardy's poetry, but whatever it makes for his strange greatness is hard to describe. Hardy's poetry, perhaps even more so than his novels, has found new audiences and appreciations as contemporary scholars and critics attempt to understand his work in the context of modernism. Virginia Woolf, a visitor to Maxgate, noticed some of Hardy's enduring power as a writer, and she said, "Thus it is no mere transcription of life at a certain time and place that Hardy has given us. It is a vision of the world and of a man's lot as they revealed themselves to a powerful imagination, a profound and poetic genius, a gentle and humane soul."